The lighthouse stood where it had always stood, on the jagged rocks at the edge of Cape Meridian, its white tower stark against the gray Atlantic sky. For 147 years, it had guided ships safely past the treacherous shoals that had claimed so many vessels in the centuries before. But on this particular November evening, as storm clouds gathered on the horizon like an army preparing for battle, the lighthouse would bear witness to something far more mysterious than any shipwreck. It would become the stage for a drama that would challenge everything Sarah Mitchell thought she knew about love, loss, and the thin veil that separates the living from the dead. Sarah had arrived at Cape Meridian 3 months earlier, fleeing a life that had collapsed around her like a house of cards. At 34, she had lost everything that mattered. Her husband Michael had died in a car accident on a rainy Tuesday morning, driving to work on the same route he had taken 1,000 times before. One moment he was alive, texting her that he would pick up groceries on the way home. The next moment, a truck driver had fallen asleep at the wheel, crossed the median, and erased Michael from existence. Just like that. No warning, no goodbye, no chance to say the things that needed to be said. The grief had been unbearable. Not the clean, dramatic grief of movies where people cry beautifully and then slowly heal. This was ugly, suffocating grief that made her forget to eat for days. That made her wake up at 3 in the morning convinced she could hear his breathing beside her, only to remember with fresh horror that she would never hear that sound again. Her friends had tried to help, but their platitudes felt like sandpaper on an open wound. Time heals all wounds, they said. He would want you to be happy. At least you have your memories. As if memories could keep you warm at night. As if memories could fill the crushing emptiness that had taken up residence in her chest. She had quit her job as a high school English teacher, sold the house where every room screamed his absence, and searched desperately for somewhere, anywhere, that didn't remind her of him. That was when she found the advertisement. Lighthouse keeper wanted for Cape Meridian Lighthouse, Maine. Room and board provided, minimal duties, solitude guaranteed. The position was mostly ceremonial now. The lighthouse had been automated decades ago, its beam controlled by computers and timers, its foghorn triggered by sensors. But the Coast Guard still maintained a keeper's residence, and the local historical society had convinced them to keep someone on site to maintain the property and conduct occasional tours for the handful of tourists who made the trek out to this remote corner of the coast. Solitude. That was what Sarah needed. A place where she could be alone with her grief, where she wouldn't have to pretend to be okay, where she could scream into the wind and no one would hear her. Cape Meridian promised all of that. The town was tiny, barely 300 people, most of them fishermen and their families. The lighthouse sat 2 miles outside of town on a rocky promontory, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that became impassable in winter storms. The keeper's house was a small, weathered structure attached to the base of the tower, its rooms sparse but functional. It was perfect. It was nowhere. The first 2 months had passed in a blur of gray days and sleepless nights. Sarah had established a routine, the kind of mindless, repetitive routine that keeps you moving when moving is all you can manage. Wake up. Make coffee. Walk the perimeter of the lighthouse grounds. Check the equipment. Respond to occasional emails from the Historical Society. Eat something, usually from a can. Read until her eyes hurt. Try to sleep. Fail to sleep. Repeat. The locals left her alone, sensing perhaps that she was someone who needed to be left alone. Occasionally, someone would drop off supplies at her door, fresh bread from the bakery or a casserole that she would eat mechanically, tasting nothing. But lately something had changed. It started small, easy to dismiss as tricks of grief and exhaustion. Objects that she was certain she had left in one place would appear in another. The book she had been reading on the kitchen table would be on her nightstand. The photograph of Michael that she kept face down in a drawer, unable to look at but unable to throw away, would be standing upright on the dresser. Her coffee mug, which she always left in the sink, would be washed and placed in the cupboard. At first, she thought she was simply forgetting things, that grief had made her absent-minded. But then came the night she heard the footsteps. It was just past midnight. She had been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the rhythmic pulse of the lighthouse beam as it swept across her window every 15 seconds. Flash. Darkness. Flash. Darkness. A metronome marking time in a world where time had become meaningless. And then she heard them. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the room above her, the watchroom at the top of the tower. Someone was climbing the spiral staircase that led to the lantern room. Her first thought was an intruder, but that made no sense. The door to the tower was locked from the inside, and she had the only key. Besides, who would break into a lighthouse in the middle of the night? What was there to steal? Her second thought was that she was finally losing her mind, that grief had pushed her across some invisible line into madness. Maybe the footsteps were just the old building settling, pipes expanding and contracting, the wind playing tricks. But as she lay there, frozen with a fear she didn't quite understand, she knew these were footsteps. Human footsteps. And they were getting closer. She forced herself out of bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. She grabbed the flashlight she kept on her nightstand and moved to the door of her bedroom. The footsteps had stopped. The lighthouse was silent except for the eternal moan of the wind and the distant crash of waves on rocks. She opened the door and shone her flashlight down the hallway. Empty. She moved toward the door that led to the tower stairs. It was closed just as she had left it. Still locked. She reached out with a trembling hand and turned the knob. Locked. For a long moment, she stood there in the darkness, trying to rationalize what she had heard. But then she heard something else. A voice. Faint, barely audible, coming from somewhere above her. She couldn't make out words, just the low murmur of someone speaking. A man's voice. And then, impossibly, the smell of coffee. Fresh coffee, rich and strong, exactly the way Michael used to make it in the mornings. Strong enough that she used to tease him that he could strip paint with it. The rational part of her brain was screaming that this was impossible, that she needed to call someone, that she needed help. But another part of her, the part that had been drowning in grief for 6 months, felt something else. Hope. Desperate, irrational, dangerous hope. She unlocked the door to the tower with shaking hands and began to climb. The spiral staircase wound upward into darkness, 117 steps from the keeper's house to the lantern room at the top. She had climbed them many times during the day, but never at night. Her flashlight beam bounced off the white-painted walls, creating dancing shadows that seemed to move with purpose. The voice grew louder as she climbed, but she still couldn't make out the words. It was definitely a man's voice, speaking in a low, steady rhythm, like someone having a phone conversation or talking to themselves. She reached the watchroom, the small chamber just below the lantern room where lighthouse keepers of the past had spent long nights monitoring the beacon and watching for ships in distress. The room was exactly as she had left it earlier that day, empty except for an old wooden desk and chair, a logbook from the 1950s that the Historical Society had left as a decorative touch, and some dusty nautical charts on the walls. But the voice was louder here. It was coming from above, from the lantern room itself. Sarah climbed the final set of stairs and emerged into the lantern room, the glass-enclosed space at the very top of the tower where the massive Fresnel lens rotated slowly, sending its beam out across the dark ocean. And there, standing with his back to her, looking out at the storm clouds gathering on the horizon, was a man. He was tall, wearing what looked like an old Coast Guard uniform from maybe the 1940s or 50s. His hair was dark, slightly too long, and even from behind she could see that he was young, probably not much older than 30. He was speaking into what looked like an old radio microphone, his voice calm and professional. "This is Cape Meridian Light, calling any vessels in the vicinity of Dead Man's Shoal. Storm warning in effect. Recommend all vessels seek safe harbor. Repeat. This is Cape Meridian Light with a storm warning. Sarah stood frozen, unable to speak, unable to move, unable to process what she was seeing. The man finished his transmission and lowered the microphone. Then slowly he turned around. And when he saw her, he smiled. A warm, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. His face was handsome in an old-fashioned way, strong-jawed and honest, the kind of face that belonged in a black-and-white photograph from another era. "You must be Sarah," he said, as if her appearance was the most natural thing in the world. "I was wondering when we would finally meet. I'm James. James Holloway. I'm the lighthouse keeper here." "But I'm the lighthouse keeper," Sarah heard herself say, her voice sounding distant and strange in her own ears. "And you can't be, this isn't possible." James's smile faded, replaced by an expression of gentle understanding. "I know this must be confusing," he said. "I've been trying to figure out how to introduce myself without frightening you. I suppose there's no easy way to say this. I died here, Sarah. 73 years ago. November 15th, 1951. But I never left." The room seemed to tilt. Sarah grabbed the railing that surrounded the lens, her knees suddenly weak. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. Ghosts weren't real. Dead people didn't stand in lighthouse towers having casual conversations. She was hallucinating, having a breakdown, finally cracking under the weight of her grief. "I know what you're thinking," James continued, taking a step toward her but stopping when he saw her flinch. "You think you're losing your mind. You're not. I'm real. Well, as real as someone like me can be. I've been here since the night the storm took my life. I've watched dozens of keepers come and go over the decades. Most of them never see me, never know I'm here. But you, Sarah, you're different. You can see me because you're standing in the same place I once stood. In that terrible space between life and death, where grief has brought you so close to the other side that the veil becomes thin." Sarah found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "This isn't real. You're not real. I'm dreaming, or I'm crazy, or I'm dying, but this isn't real." James shook his head slowly. "I said the same thing, the first few years after I died. I couldn't accept it. I kept thinking I would wake up, that this was just a nightmare, that any moment I would be alive again, back in my body, back in my life. But eventually, I had to accept the truth. I'm here. I've been here for 73 years. And you, Sarah Mitchell, are the first person in all that time who has truly seen me." The storm that had been threatening finally broke. Rain began to lash against the glass of the lantern room, and thunder rumbled in the distance. The lighthouse beam continued its eternal rotation, indifferent to the drama unfolding in its heart. Sarah's mind was racing, trying to find some logical explanation, some way to make sense of this. But the longer she looked at James, the more she could feel that he was telling the truth. There was something about him, something in the way he looked at her, that felt undeniably real. "How did you die?" she asked finally, surprising herself with the question. James walked to the window and looked out at the storm. "A night like this one," he said. "November 1951. I had been the keeper here for 3 years. I loved this place, loved the solitude, the rhythm of the days, the feeling of doing something that mattered. Every night I kept this light burning. I was saving lives. Ships depended on me. Sailors I would never meet trusted me with their lives. It gave me purpose." He paused, and Sarah could see the pain in his profile. "But I made a mistake. The storm came up faster than anyone predicted. There was a fishing boat out there, the Mary Catherine, with 4 men aboard. I could see their lights, see them struggling in the waves, being pushed toward the shoals. I knew they couldn't see the lighthouse beam through the storm. I knew they were going to wreck unless someone warned them. So I did something stupid. I got in my boat and went out after them. Sarah moved closer, drawn into the story despite herself. What happened? I reached them, James said. I got close enough to shout, to wave them away from the shoals. They saw me, changed course, made it safely back to harbor. All 4 of them lived. But my boat, my little boat, couldn't handle the waves. It capsized. I went into the water. The cold, God, Sarah, the cold was like knives in my chest. I tried to swim back, but the current was too strong. I was wearing too many clothes. I went under. And when I woke up, I was standing right here in this lantern room, watching the sun rise on a world I was no longer part of. The raw pain in his voice was so real, so human, that Sarah felt tears welling in her eyes. I'm sorry, she whispered. Don't be, James said, turning back to her. Those men lived. They went home to their families. One of them, Thomas Baker, his son is now 78 years old, lives in town. I see him sometimes when he visits the Lighthouse with his grandchildren. He doesn't know I'm here, of course. But I know that he exists because of what I did. That has to count for something, doesn't it? Sarah thought about Michael, about the randomness of his death, about how he died doing nothing more dangerous than driving to work. At least you saved lives, she said. Michael he just died. No reason, no purpose, no heroic sacrifice. Just a tired truck driver and bad timing. What does that count for? James looked at her with such understanding that fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. I've watched you these past 3 months, he said gently. I've seen your pain. I know what it's like to lose everything in a moment. But Sarah, there's something you need to understand. Your husband's death may seem meaningless, but his life wasn't. Love is never meaningless. The years you spent together, the way you changed each other, the way you became better people because of each other, that all still matters. Death doesn't erase that. How would you know? Sarah asked, her voice breaking. You died young. You never had what Michael and I had. You don't know what it's like to lose that. You're right, James said. I died at 29. I never married, never had children, never grew old with someone I loved. But do you know what the worst part of being here has been? It's not the loneliness. It's not being trapped in this tower for 73 years. It's watching people like you throw away the gift I never got. You're alive, Sarah. You have decades ahead of you. You can still love, still laugh, still make a difference in the world. But instead, you're choosing to die alongside your husband. You're just doing it more slowly. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, to explain that he didn't understand, that her pain was too great, that life without Michael wasn't worth living. But the words wouldn't come, because somewhere, in the deepest part of herself, she knew he was right. The storm intensified, battering the lighthouse with wind and rain. Lightning flashed, illuminating the angry sea below. Sarah and James stood in the lantern room. 2 souls caught between worlds, neither fully alive nor fully dead. And in that moment, Sarah made a decision. If James could be real, if the impossible could happen, then maybe there was more to existence than she had believed. Maybe death wasn't the end. Maybe Michael wasn't truly gone. Can you help me? She asked James. Can you help me contact Michael? If you're here, if ghosts are real, then maybe he's trying to reach me. Maybe he's somewhere, waiting for me to find him. James's expression filled with sorrow. That's not how it works, Sarah. I'm here because I chose to stay. In that moment between life and death, I made a decision. I couldn't let go of this lighthouse, this place, this purpose. So I stayed. But your husband, from everything I've seen of you, everything I know about him, he was ready. He didn't choose to stay. He moved on to whatever comes next. And you can't follow him, not yet. Not for hopefully many, many years. Then what good are you? Sarah cried out in frustration and pain. What good is any of this if I can't see him again, if I can't talk to him, if I can't tell him all the things I never got to say? James moved closer, and for the first time, Sarah noticed that she could almost see through him, that he was translucent in the strange light of the lantern room. Maybe, he said softly, I'm here to tell you what he would say if he could. That he loves you. That he doesn't want you to waste your life grieving for him. That every moment you refuse to live is an insult to the years you spent together. That the best way to honor his memory is to take the love he gave you and use it to make the world better. Isn't that what he would say? Sarah collapsed to her knees, sobs racking her body. James knelt beside her, and though he couldn't touch her, she could feel something, a warmth, a presence that was undeniably comforting. She cried for everything she had lost, for Michael, for the future they would never have, for the children they had planned to have someday, for the dreams that had died with him. But she also cried for herself, for the person she had been before his death, for the Sarah Mitchell who had loved teaching, who had laughed easily, who had believed in happy endings. When her tears finally subsided, she looked up at James. Why can I see you? She asked. Why now? Because you needed to, he said simply. Because you were so close to giving up completely. Because sometimes, when someone is drowning, they need someone to throw them a rope, even if that someone has been dead for 73 years. Over the following weeks, Sarah and James fell into an unlikely friendship. Every night, after the sun set and the lighthouse beam began its eternal vigil, James would appear. Sometimes they talked for hours, sitting in the watch room while the lens rotated above them. James told her stories about his life before the lighthouse, about growing up in Boston, about serving in World War II, about falling in love with the ocean. Sarah told him about her marriage, about teaching, about the 1,000 tiny moments that had made up her life with Michael. James couldn't leave the lighthouse. He was bound to it, tethered by the same choice that had kept him here for 7 decades. But within its walls he was remarkably solid, remarkably present. During the day, he was barely visible, more of a feeling than a sight. But at night, especially during storms, he became almost corporeal, solid enough that Sarah sometimes forgot he wasn't alive. He made her laugh again, which felt like a betrayal at first. How could she laugh when Michael was dead? But James reminded her that laughter wasn't an insult to the dead. The dead, he said with a wry smile, probably wish we would lighten up a bit. All this moping isn't doing anyone any good. Michael wouldn't want you to forget how to smile. James also made her angry, which was perhaps even more important. He challenged her, pushed her, refused to let her wallow in self-pity. When she spent entire days in bed, he would appear in her room at noon, somehow managing to radiate disapproval even in his translucent state. Get up, he would say. The world is still turning, whether you participate or not. When she stopped responding to emails from the Historical Society, he nagged her until she wrote back. When she let the lighthouse grounds fall into disrepair, he followed her around, pointing out every weed, every patch of peeling paint, every sign of neglect. You're a pain, she told him one evening, as she reluctantly pulled weeds from the garden that the previous keeper had planted. Good, he replied, leaning against the lighthouse tower in a way that should have been impossible for someone without physical form. Someone needs to be. You're too comfortable in your grief, Sarah. You've made a home in it. But grief isn't meant to be a home. It's meant to be a storm you pass through. As November turned to December, something shifted in Sarah. She couldn't point to a single moment when it happened, but gradually, imperceptibly, she began to rejoin the world. She started responding to emails from her former colleagues. She reached out to her sister, whom she had been avoiding for months. She began cooking real meals instead of eating from cans. She even agreed to conduct a tour of the lighthouse for a local school group, something the previous keeper had done regularly, but that Sarah had refused to do. The day of the tour, she was nervous. 23 third graders and their teachers arrived at the lighthouse on a bright December morning. their excited chatter filling the usually silent grounds. Sarah led them up the tower, pointing out features of the lighthouse, telling them about its history, explaining how the lens worked. And as she taught, as she saw the wonder in their young faces, she felt something she hadn't felt in months. Purpose. That night, James was beaming with pride. "You were magnificent," he told her. "You're a natural teacher. Those kids will remember today for the rest of their lives." It felt good, Sarah admitted. "I'd forgotten what that felt like, connecting with students, seeing them learn, making them curious about the world." "Then why did you give it up?" James asked. "Teaching, I mean. After Michael died, why did you quit?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "Because everything reminded me of him," she finally said. "The school where we met. The classroom where he proposed. The students who had been to our wedding. I couldn't separate my work from my grief. They were tangled together." "And now?" James prompted gently. "Now," Sarah said slowly, "I think maybe they don't have to be tangled. Maybe I can teach and still honor his memory. Maybe I can love my work and still love him. Maybe both things can be true at once." James smiled. "Now you're getting it." But even as Sarah began to heal, she noticed changes in James. He was appearing less frequently. Some nights she would wait for him, but he wouldn't come. Other nights he would appear but seem distant, distracted, as if he were listening to something she couldn't hear. When she asked him about it, he was evasive. Then came the night when everything changed. It was December 21st, the winter solstice, the longest night of the year. A massive storm had moved in from the Atlantic, the kind of nor'easter that could trap you inside for days. Sarah was in the keeper's house, listening to the wind howl around the tower, when James appeared. But this time he looked different. More solid than she had ever seen him, but also somehow more translucent, as if he were simultaneously becoming more and less real. "We need to talk," he said, and the seriousness in his voice made Sarah's heart sink. "What's wrong?" she asked. "I'm leaving," James said simply. "After tonight, you won't see me anymore." Sarah felt as if the floor had dropped out from under her. "What?" "No. You can't leave. You've been here for 73 years. Why would you leave now?" James moved to the window, looking out at the storm. "Because you don't need me anymore," he said. "When you arrived here 3 months ago, you were drowning. You needed someone to pull you back from the edge. That's what I've been doing, Sarah. That's why you could see me. But now you're healing. You're finding your way back to life. Which means my work here is done." "But I still need you," Sarah protested, surprised by how much she meant it. "You're my friend. You've helped me so much. Don't go." "If I stay," James said, turning to face her, "you'll never fully heal. You'll use me as a crutch, a substitute for the living relationships you need to rebuild. I'll become another way for you to hide from the world. And I can't let that happen. I've been here too long, Sarah. 73 years in this tower. I stayed because I thought I still had a purpose, still had work to do. But I realize now that I was just afraid. Afraid of what comes next. Afraid of letting go. You've taught me something important. You've shown me that it's okay to move on, that letting go isn't the same as forgetting. It's time for both of us to take that step." Tears were streaming down Sarah's face. "Where will you go? What happens to ghosts when they leave?" "I don't know," James admitted. "But I'm not afraid anymore. Maybe there's nothing. Maybe there's something beautiful. Either way, it's time to find out. I've kept this lighthouse for 73 years. I've guided countless ships safely home. That's enough. It's someone else's turn now. It's your turn." The storm reached its peak, wind shrieking around the tower, rain hammering against the windows like fists demanding entry. The lighthouse beam continued its rotation, steady and sure, just as it had been for 147 years. And in that moment, Sarah understood. James had been her lighthouse, guiding her through the storm of her grief. But she didn't need a lighthouse anymore. She had found her way back to shore. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "For everything. For saving my life, even though I didn't know I needed saving. For reminding me that life is still worth living. For being here when I had no one else." James smiled, that warm, genuine smile she had come to love. "Take care of my lighthouse," he said. "And take care of yourself. Live, Sarah. Live the life I never got to live. Fall in love again someday. Have children. Grow old. Make mistakes. Learn from them. Teach more students. Change lives. Be messy and complicated and fully, completely alive. Do it for yourself. Do it for Michael. Do it for me." "I will," Sarah promised. "I'll try." "Good," James said. "And Sarah, one more thing. When your time finally comes, when you're 97 and surrounded by grandchildren, and you close your eyes for the last time, maybe you'll see him again. Maybe that's what comes next. I'd like to think so. I'd like to think that all the love we give and receive in life doesn't just disappear. That it's waiting for us, on the other side." The lighthouse beam swept across the room. And in that flash of light, James began to fade. Not slowly, but not suddenly either. Just gradually becoming less solid, less present, like morning mist burning away in the sun. Sarah reached out her hand, though she knew she couldn't touch him, and he reached out his. For just a moment, she thought she felt something, the faintest pressure, warm and real, and then gone. "Goodbye, Sarah Mitchell," James said, his voice already distant, already part of the wind. "Goodbye, James Holloway," Sarah whispered. "Thank you for being my lighthouse." And then he was gone. The watch room was empty except for Sarah, and the sound of the storm, and the eternal rotation of the lens. She stood there for a long time, crying again. But this time her tears were different. Not the hopeless, drowning tears of the past months, but something else. Tears of gratitude. Tears of grief. Yes, but also tears of acceptance. Tears of goodbye. The storm passed, as all storms do. By morning, the sky was clear, washed clean by the rain. Sarah walked down to the rocky shore and stood looking out at the ocean. At the vast expanse of water that had taken James's life 73 years ago, and somehow given her back hers. The waves rolled in, eternal and indifferent, and somewhere out there, fishermen were checking their boats and preparing for another day of work, never knowing that a man who died saving their grandfathers had finally found peace. Sarah pulled out her phone, the first time she had used it for anything but the most necessary calls in months. She scrolled through her contacts and found her sister's number. Her finger hovered over it for a moment, and then she pressed call. Her sister answered on the second ring. "Sarah? Is that you? Are you okay?" "Hi, Emma," Sarah said, and she was surprised to hear that her voice sounded almost normal, almost like her old voice. "Yeah, it's me. I'm okay. Well, I'm getting there. Listen, I know I've been terrible about staying in touch. I know I've pushed everyone away. But I'm ready now. I'm ready to come back. Can we talk? Really talk?" Her sister's voice cracked with emotion. "Oh my God, Sarah, yes. Yes, of course. I've been so worried about you. We all have. Tell me everything. Tell me where you are, what you've been doing, how I can help." And Sarah did. She talked for over an hour, standing on the rocks beside the lighthouse, watching the sun climb higher in the clear winter sky. She talked about Michael, about her grief, about the darkness she had been in. She didn't mention James. That story was hers alone, something private and precious that she would carry with her. But she talked about finding hope again, about remembering why life mattered, about being ready to rejoin the world. When she finally hung up, she felt lighter than she had in months. She walked back to the keeper's house and sat down at the desk. She opened her laptop and began to compose an email. It was addressed to the principal of the school, where she used to teach. The message was simple. She was writing to ask if they had any openings for the next school year. She understood if they had filled her position. But if there was any possibility of coming back, she was ready. She was ready to teach again. She hit send before she could second-guess herself. Then she opened another email, this one to the Historical Society. She had an idea. The lighthouse needed more than just a caretaker. It needed someone who could turn it into a real educational resource, someone who could develop programs for schools, create exhibits about maritime history, maybe even start a summer camp for kids interested in science and navigation. She had experience with curriculum development. She had connections in the education community. And she had time, lots of time during the off-season, to make it happen. Would they be interested in discussing it? She sent that email too. Then she closed her laptop and looked around the keeper's house. Really looked at it for the first time since arriving. It was a mess. Dishes in the sink, laundry piled on chairs, dust on every surface. She stood up and got to work. She cleaned. She organized. She threw open windows to let in the cold, clean air. She scrubbed and swept and straightened until the little house gleamed. As she worked, she thought about James, about his story, about the choice he made 73 years ago to save 4 men he didn't know. She thought about how one moment of courage, one decision to act despite the danger, had rippled forward through time. Those 4 fishermen had lived. They had children. Those children had children. At least 3 of them still lived in town. How many other lives had been touched because James Holloway had refused to let those men die? Hundreds, thousands. And now, in some small way, his choice had saved her too. That afternoon, Sarah drove into town for the first time in weeks. She stopped at the small grocery store and bought real food, vegetables and fresh bread and ingredients for actual meals. She stopped at the hardware store and bought paint and brushes to touch up the peeling trim on the keeper's house. She stopped at the library and checked out armfuls of books about lighthouse history and marine biology and teaching methods. And she stopped at the tiny cafe on Main Street and ordered a coffee and a sandwich, and sat at a table by the window, watching people go about their ordinary lives. An old man came in, moving slowly with a cane. The woman behind the counter greeted him warmly. "The usual Tom?" she asked. He nodded and settled into a chair near Sarah's table. Something about him made her look twice. There was a weathered dignity to him, the bearing of someone who had spent his life working on the water. "Excuse me," Sarah found herself saying. "Are you Tom Baker?" The old man looked at her in surprise. "That's right. Do I know you?" "No," Sarah said. "But I'm the new keeper at Cape Meridian Lighthouse. I've been reading about the lighthouse's history, and I came across a story about a storm in 1951. 4 fishermen were saved that night. I believe your father was one of them." Tom's face transformed, years falling away as memory swept over him. "My God," he said. "I haven't thought about that story in ages." "Yes, my father was on the Mary Catherine that night. He used to tell us about it when we were kids. Said they were headed straight for the shoals in the storm, couldn't see a blessed thing. Then out of nowhere, this crazy lighthouse keeper comes rowing out in a little boat, waving and shouting, warning them off. Saved all their lives. But the keeper, he went into the water. Never made it back." "James Holloway," Sarah said softly. "That's right," Tom said, shaking his head. "Died saving men he didn't even know. My father always said we owed our lives to James Holloway. Everything we had, everything we built, we had because of him. He was a hero, that man. A real hero." Sarah felt tears prickling her eyes again, but she blinked them back. "Yes," she said. "Yes, he was." She and Tom talked for another hour. He told her stories about growing up in Cape Meridian, about following his father into the fishing trade, about watching the lighthouse every time he went out on the water, and thinking about the man who had died to save his father. When they finally parted ways, Tom shook her hand warmly and said, "You take care of that lighthouse, miss. It's a special place. Important place. "I will," Sarah promised. "I'll take very good care of it." That night, Sarah stood in the lantern room for the first time since James had disappeared. The lighthouse beam rotated steadily, sending its light out across the dark water. She could feel his absence. The tower felt empty in a way it hadn't before. But it didn't feel sad. It felt peaceful, settled, as if something that had been out of balance for 73 years had finally been set right. She pulled out the old logbook that sat on the desk in the watchroom. It dated from the 1950s, and she had leafed through it many times, reading the neat handwriting of keepers long dead, their daily notations about weather and ships and the endless routine of lighthouse work. Now she flipped to November 1951, and there, in careful script, she found the final entry written by James Holloway. November 15, 1951. Weather deteriorating rapidly. Barometer falling. Storm approaching from northeast. All vessels advised to seek harbor. Mary Catherine spotted in distress near Deadman's Shoal. AM proceeding to render assistance. If anything should happen, let it be known that I acted according to the highest traditions of the lighthouse service. The light must always serve life. That is our purpose. That is our duty. That is our honor. Below the entry, in a different hand, someone had written, "Keeper James Holloway lost at sea this date while successfully rescuing 4 fishermen from the Mary Catherine. All 4 men survived. Keeper Holloway's body was never recovered. He died a hero." Sarah ran her fingers over the faded ink, feeling a connection across time to the man who had written these words on what he must have known might be his last night alive. He had chosen courage over safety, service over self-preservation. And 73 years later, trapped between life and death by that same choice, he had done it again. He had saved her. She picked up a pen and turned to a blank page at the back of the logbook. For a moment, she wasn't sure what to write. Then the words came. December 21st, 2024. Winter solstice. The longest night has passed, and the light endures. James Holloway kept this lighthouse for 3 years in life and 73 years beyond. He served with honor, with courage, and with grace. Tonight, he has finally gone home. His watch is ended. Mine has just begun. The light must always serve life. I understand that now. Thank you, James. Fair winds and following seas. She closed the logbook and placed it carefully back on the desk. Then she descended the spiral staircase, turning off lights as she went, until she reached the keeper's house. But she didn't feel alone. She felt accompanied by something larger than herself. The presence of everyone who had ever kept this lighthouse. Everyone who had ever looked to its beam for guidance. Everyone who had ever been saved by its light. The weeks that followed were the busiest Sarah had known in months. The principal of her old school called. They did have an opening, a teacher who was taking an extended medical leave. Would Sarah be interested in filling in for the spring semester? It would be a chance to see if she was ready to return permanently. Sarah said yes before she could overthink it. The Historical Society loved her proposal about expanding the lighthouse's educational mission. They offered her a small budget and complete creative freedom. Within days, she was buried in planning, designing lesson plans, reaching out to schools, organizing materials. She drove back to the city to pack up her things from storage, the belongings she had abandoned when she fled to Cape Meridian. Walking into the storage unit was hard. Every box was a reminder of her old life, her life with Michael. But instead of the crushing grief she expected, she felt something different. Bittersweet nostalgia, yes. Sadness, certainly. But also gratitude. Gratitude for the years they had shared, for the memories these objects represented, for the love that had shaped her into who she was. She sorted through everything carefully. Some things she kept, the photographs and letters and small treasures that meant the most. Some things she donated, clothes and furniture and kitchen items that someone else could use. And some things she threw away, the clutter and debris of a shared life, the things that served no purpose except to take up space. It took her 3 full days, and when she was done, her entire life fit into her car with room to spare. On her way back to Cape Meridian, she made a detour. The cemetery where Michael was buried was small and peaceful, set on a hillside overlooking a valley. She hadn't been there since the funeral. She had been too afraid, too raw, too certain that seeing his grave would destroy the fragile control she had maintained. But now, on a cold January afternoon with snow beginning to fall, she walked up the hill and found his headstone. Michael Chun, beloved husband, son and friend. His was a life of joy and kindness. Too short, but well lived. Sarah knelt in the snow and placed her hand on the cold marble. "Hi, baby," she said softly. "I'm sorry it's taken me so long to visit. I've been drowning. But I'm learning to swim again. I met someone who helped me understand some things. About grief. About living. About honoring you by not dying alongside you." The snow fell softly, dusting her hair and shoulders. She told Michael about Cape Meridian, about the lighthouse, about her plans to return to teaching. She told him about Tom Baker and the story of his father's rescue. She didn't tell him about James, not directly, but she told him that she had learned something important. That love doesn't end with death. That the love they shared was still real, still part of her, still shaping who she was and who she would become. That she could carry him with her while still moving forward. "I'll always love you," she said, tears freezing on her cheeks. "But I have to keep living." "You would want me to keep living." "I know you would. So I'm going to try. I'm going to mess it up sometimes. I'm going to have bad days. But I'm going to try. For you. For me. For everyone we loved." She stayed for a while longer, sitting in the snow, remembering. Their first date, a disaster where everything that could go wrong did go wrong, but they laughed so hard they cried. Their wedding day, perfect and chaotic in equal measure. The 1,000 quiet mornings of coffee and conversation. The inside jokes and shared dreams and comfortable silence of two people who knew each other completely. All of it was still real. Death couldn't take that away. When she finally stood to leave, she felt different. Lighter. Not because her grief was gone, it would never be completely gone, but because she had finally learned to carry it differently. Not as a crushing weight that held her in place, but as something she could bear while still moving forward. James had been right. Grief wasn't meant to be a home. It was meant to be a storm you pass through. By February, Sarah was back in the classroom. It was strange at first, standing in front of students again, seeing their expectant faces, feeling the familiar rhythm of teaching. But strange in a good way, like rediscovering a part of herself she had thought was lost. She taught with a new intensity, a new appreciation for the privilege of shaping young minds. Every lesson felt precious. Every moment of connection with a student felt like a gift. Her colleagues welcomed her back warmly, though some seemed uncertain how to act around her, as if grief might be contagious. But Sarah made it easy for them. She talked about Michael openly, sharing memories without falling apart, acknowledging her loss without making it the center of every conversation. Slowly, people relaxed around her. She was invited to lunch, to happy hours, to book club meetings. She said yes more often than not. She was rejoining the world. At the Lighthouse, she threw herself into developing educational programs. She created a marine biology curriculum for middle schoolers, complete with field trips to the rocky shore to study tide pools. She designed a physics lesson built around how lighthouse lenses work, demonstrating the principles of optics and light. She partnered with the local historical society to create an exhibit about the lighthouse's history, featuring photographs and artifacts, and, prominently displayed, the logbook containing James Holloway's final entry. The exhibit opened in April, and the turnout exceeded all expectations. It seemed the whole town came, plus visitors from up and down the coast. Tom Baker was there, in a place of honor, sharing his father's story about the night James Holloway saved his life. There were tears and laughter, and a sense of community coming together to honor one of their own. At the end of the evening, Tom approached Sarah. "You've done something special here," he said, gesturing around the exhibit. "You've brought James back to life in a way. Reminded people what he did, why it mattered. Thank you for that." Sarah smiled. "He deserves to be remembered. Heroes shouldn't be forgotten." "No," Tom agreed. "They shouldn't. And neither should the people who keep their memories alive." That night, after everyone had gone, Sarah stood in the lantern room and watched the beam sweep across the dark water. She thought about James, wondered where he was, if there was a somewhere for him to be. She liked to think that he had found Michael, that somehow in whatever came after, they had met. Two men who died too young. Two men who had shaped her life in profound ways. She liked to think they were together, maybe comparing notes, maybe laughing about the woman they had both tried to save. "I hope you found peace, James," she whispered to the empty room. "I hope it was worth it, letting go. I hope you're somewhere beautiful." The lighthouse beam was her only answer, rotating steadily, faithfully, casting its light into the darkness. Always there. Always certain. Always guiding ships safely home. By summer, Sarah's life had found a new rhythm. She taught during the school year, developed programs at the Lighthouse during her off hours, and spent her summers running educational camps for kids. The Keeper's House, once a place of isolation and despair, had become a home. She painted the walls bright colors. She planted a garden. She adopted a scruffy rescue dog named Beacon who followed her everywhere and barked at the gulls. She made friends in town, real friends, people she could call when she was having a bad day or invite over for dinner. She dated a little, nothing serious, but enough to remind herself that her heart was still capable of feeling attraction, of getting those nervous butterflies, of hoping for connection. It felt like a betrayal at first, even thinking about being with someone other than Michael. But she remembered James's words. "Live the life I never got to live. Fall in love again someday." Not yet. She wasn't ready yet. But someday. Maybe. On the anniversary of Michael's death, Sarah took the day off and drove to the cemetery. It was easier this time. Still sad, still hard, but not devastating. She brought flowers and sat by his grave and told him about her year. About the teaching and the lighthouse and the friends she had made. About Beacon and the garden and the summer camps. About the life she was building, piece by piece, day by day. "I'm okay," she told him. "Not all the time. I still have moments when I miss you so much I can't breathe. But I'm okay. I'm living. I'm doing what you would have wanted me to do. I'm being brave." The wind rustled through the trees, and for just a moment, Sarah could have sworn she felt something. Not a touch exactly. Not a presence. But something. A warmth. En assurance. A sense that Michael had heard her. That he approved. That he was proud of her. Or maybe it was just the wind. Maybe it was her own need for closure creating meaning where none existed. It didn't really matter. What mattered was that she felt it. What mattered was that she believed. The summer tourists came and went. Sarah gave countless tours, told James's story dozens of times, watched children's faces light up with wonder as they learned about how lighthouses work. She met people from all over the world who had come specifically to see Cape Meridian Lighthouse, drawn by its history, its beauty, its enduring presence. Many of them told her their own stories of loss and recovery. A widow who had traveled alone for the first time since her husband's death. A father visiting lighthouses with his daughter to honor his late son's passion for maritime history. A young woman who had survived cancer and was celebrating by seeing as many lighthouses as she could. Everyone, it seemed, was carrying something. Everyone was learning to navigate their own storms. In September, Sarah received a call from a publisher. They had heard about the exhibit, about the program she had developed, about James Holloway's story. Would she be interested in writing a book? A combination of James's history, the Lighthouse's story, and her own journey with grief and recovery. It could help people, they said. It could make a difference. Sarah's first instinct was to say no. Her story was private, personal, not meant for public consumption. And how could she write about James without revealing the truth of how she had known him? But the more she thought about it, the more she realized she could write about the emotional truth without the literal truth. She could write about finding hope in darkness, about unexpected guides appearing when we need them most, about learning to live again after devastating loss. She didn't need to convince anyone that ghosts were real. She only needed to convince them that healing was possible. She said yes to the publisher. And over the following months, between teaching and running programs and maintaining the Lighthouse, she wrote. She wrote about Michael and their life together. She wrote about the darkness that followed his death, the desperate, drowning grief that had brought her to Cape Meridian. She wrote about the Lighthouse and its history and James Holloway's heroic sacrifice. She wrote about finding purpose again, about choosing life over mere existence, about honoring the dead by living fully. The book was published the following spring, titled simply The Light Endures. It found an audience far larger than Sarah had expected. People wrote to her from all over the country, sharing their own stories of loss and recovery, thanking her for putting words to experiences they had thought were unspeakable. She did readings and book signings, appeared on podcasts and morning shows. The publicity brought even more visitors to Cape Meridian Lighthouse, and the Historical Society had to expand their hours to accommodate the crowds. Through it all, Sarah sometimes felt James's presence, not in any tangible way, but in the sense that she was doing what he would have wanted. She was keeping his memory alive. She was helping others the way he had helped her. She was serving life, just as he had always served it. 2 years after James had disappeared, on another winter solstice, Sarah stood in the lantern room and raised a glass of wine to the empty air. To James Holloway, she said softly, "Lighthouse keeper, hero, friend, ghost. Thank you for saving my life. Thank you for teaching me how to let go. Thank you for showing me that love doesn't end, it just changes form. Wherever you are, I hope you're at peace. I hope you're free. I hope you know that you mattered." The lighthouse beam swept around, illuminating her face for just a moment. And in that brief flash of light, Sarah could have sworn she saw something. A shimmer in the air. A suggestion of a smile. A feeling of warmth and approval and goodbye. But when the beam came around again, there was nothing. Just empty air and the eternal rotation of the lens. Sarah smiled. Real or imagined, it didn't matter. She had gotten her answer. James was free. And so was she. She descended the stairs and walked out onto the rocks, Beacon trotting at her heels. The night was clear and cold, the sky full of stars. She stood at the edge of the promontory, looking out at the vast dark ocean, thinking about all the ships that had been guided safely past these rocks over the past 149 years, thinking about all the lives that had been saved, all the disasters that had been averted, all because someone had built a lighthouse here, and someone else had committed to keeping its light burning. One light in the darkness. That was all it took sometimes. One light to guide you home. One person to remind you that dawn always comes, no matter how long the night. One moment of courage or kindness or connection to change everything. James had been her light. And now, in her own small way, she was trying to be that light for others. Through her teaching, her programs, her book, her willingness to be honest about her pain and her healing. She couldn't save everyone. She couldn't fix every broken heart or heal every wound. But she could be present. She could be honest. She could shine whatever light she had and trust that someone out there in the darkness needed it. The ocean rolled in, eternal and indifferent, and Sarah felt at peace. She had survived the worst thing she could imagine. She had walked through the valley of the shadow of death and come out the other side. She had been given a second chance, an unexpected gift from an unexpected source. And she was determined not to waste it. She thought about Michael, sent him love across whatever distance separated them. She thought about James, sent him gratitude across whatever veil divided the living from the dead. And she thought about herself, about the woman she had been and the woman she was becoming. Stronger, wiser, more compassionate, more aware of how fragile and precious life was, and how important it was to live it fully while you could. Beacon barked at a crab scuttling across the rocks, then looked up at Sarah with absolute trust and devotion. She laughed and scratched his ears. "Come on, boy," she said. "Let's go home." They walked back to the keeper's house together, woman and dog, while behind them the lighthouse beam continued its eternal vigil, sweeping across the dark water, guiding ships safely home, serving life, as it had always served life, as it would continue to serve life long after Sarah was gone, long after everyone now living had passed into memory and legend. The light endures. That was the lesson James had taught her. That was the truth she carried with her now. Darkness might be powerful, but light was eternal. Grief might be overwhelming, but love was stronger. Death might take our bodies, but it couldn't touch the connections we forged, the lives we touched, the difference we made in the world. Sarah Mitchell had come to Cape Meridian Lighthouse to die. Instead, she had learned how to live. And in learning how to live, she had discovered something profound. That we save ourselves by saving others. That we heal by helping others heal. That we honor the dead not by joining them, but by taking the love they gave us and using it to make the world a little brighter, a little kinder, a little more full of hope. The lighthouse stood where it had always stood, on the jagged rocks at the edge of Cape Meridian, its white tower stark against the night sky. For 149 years, it had guided ships safely past the treacherous shoals. And on this particular night, in its lantern room, a light continued to burn. Not just the physical light of the lamp, but something else. Something that couldn't be measured or quantified or explained. The light of courage. The light of compassion. The light of one person choosing to help another, even at great cost to themselves. The light that James Holloway had kindled 75 years ago, and that Sarah Mitchell now carried forward into an unknown future. And somewhere in whatever place exists beyond this world, perhaps two men were watching. One who had died saving strangers. One who had died going to work on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Perhaps they were proud of the woman they had both loved in different ways. Perhaps they were raising their own glasses to her, toasting her courage, celebrating her healing, honoring her choice to keep living. Or perhaps there was nothing. Perhaps death was simply the end. And all that remained of James Holloway and Michael Chun were memories and influence, and the ways they had changed the people who loved them. Perhaps Sarah's visions of James had been nothing more than grief-induced hallucinations, her mind's way of giving her the permission she needed to heal. It didn't matter. The effect was the same. Sarah had been saved, and now in turn she would save others. That was how it worked. That was how light endured in darkness. One person helping another, who helped another, who helped another, in an endless chain of compassion stretching across time and space. The lighthouse beam swept around again, and Sarah stood at the window of the keeper's house, watching it. Tomorrow she would teach. She would inspire students, develop new programs, write more words, reach more people. She would live fully and completely, making the most of every moment, never forgetting how close she had come to wasting this precious gift. But tonight, she simply stood and watched the light and felt grateful. Grateful for Michael and the years they had shared. Grateful for James and the guidance he had given. Grateful for this second chance, this unexpected grace, this reminder that even in our darkest moments, help can come from the most unlikely sources. The light swept around, steady and sure, just as it had been for 149 years, just as it would be for another 149 years and beyond. And Sarah smiled, and closed the curtain, and went to bed and slept peacefully for the first time in 2 years. The light endures. In darkness, in storms, in the depths of grief and despair, the light endures. And as long as there are people willing to keep that light burning, to serve life with courage and compassion and grace, there is always hope, always a way forward, always a path home. This is the story of a lighthouse and a keeper, and a ghost, and a woman learning to live again. But more than that, it is the story of how we save each other, how love transcends death, how light endures in darkness, how one person's courage, even across the span of 73 years, can reach forward and pull another soul back from the brink. Cape Meridian Lighthouse still stands today. If you visit, you will find excellent programs and exhibits, and possibly a friendly dog named Beacon. You will hear the story of James Holloway, the keeper who died saving 4 fishermen on a stormy November night. You will learn about lighthouse history and marine biology, and the physics of light. And if you are lucky, if you are paying attention, if you are open to it, you might learn something else. Something about grief and healing, and the courage it takes to keep living when everything in you wants to give up. The light endures. Remember that. Whatever darkness you are facing, whatever storm you are weathering, whatever grief threatens to drown you, remember, the light endures. And so will you.